Day 90 began with a voice, faint at first, calling across the burnt-out shell of the refugee camp, a voice that did not belong to any of the survivors, and yet every survivor heard it, even those who had gone deaf in the first weeks of the outbreak. They called it the whisper, a sound too human to be the wind, too sharp to be an animal cry. And when the camp woke, they found 3 corpses sitting upright against the perimeter fence, their dead throats vibrating with words they could not possibly form. Commander Reyes had been through everything: the fall of the city, the mass burn pits, the government's last broadcast. But this broke something in her, because the dead were not supposed to talk. They were not supposed to know their names. And yet one of them rasped her name like it had known her in life. The survivors gathered in silence, guns drawn, staring at the corpses that did not lunge, did not bite, only spoke, and what they spoke were names, the names of everyone in camp, one after the other, until the last name was read like the closing of a roll call, and the whispering stopped. Reyes ordered the bodies burned. But as the flames consumed them, the voices grew louder, shrieking in unison, until the smoke rose black into the sky, and something in the tree line screamed back in answer. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, as though the fire had awoken something that had been waiting. No one slept that night, and by dawn the voices returned, this time coming from the forest itself, moving closer, speaking in a language no one had heard before, but which made every survivor clutch. Their head, like a migraine, had struck blood trickling from their noses. Carter, one of the few who still had hope, tried to reason with Reyes, told her they needed to leave the camp to head for the mountains. But Reyes refused. They had worked too hard to build the barricades, to secure the perimeter, and she said abandoning it now would mean death for all of them. By noon the first attack came. Not a charge like the early days of the outbreak, but a slow, methodical advance. The dead walking to the perimeter in lines, their mouths open, chanting in unison. And when the first gunshot rang out, the dead did not run. They kept chanting, even as their bodies dropped. The chanting did something to the living. Some fell to their knees, clutching their heads, screaming, begging for the noise to stop, and others simply stood still, eyes wide, until the dead reached the fence and began tearing at the wire, their hands bleeding but never slowing. Reyes gave the order to open fire, and for 3 hours the survivors poured bullets into the mass of bodies, stacking them high until the fence was more flesh than steel. And when the last magazine ran dry, the forest fell silent, as though mocking their exhaustion. That night no one spoke, no one ate, and then, just as the moon reached its zenith, the pile of bodies began to move, the corpses reassembling themselves into something that looked almost human. One massive shape that stood taller than the watchtower and turned its head toward the camp. It spoke with a single voice, a voice that carried through the night like a storm wind, saying that the dead were not the enemy, that the living were, that this world had belonged to the silent for too long, and now it was time to make everyone hear. The survivors broke at the sound of it, some running into the dark, some shooting themselves before the thing could finish its sentence. And Reyes stood on the tower with her last grenade and said she would not let the dead take her alive. But Carter grabbed her hand and told her there was still a way out. They left the camp in flames, running through the forest with the whisper behind them, the voices of the dead calling their names, promising them that they would be found no matter how far they ran, no matter where they hid, because now the dead knew how to speak, and that meant they could never truly be alone again. For 3 days they ran, scavenging what they could, sleeping only when exhaustion forced them down. And each morning they woke to find fresh words scratched into the dirt around their camp, words that spelled out their thoughts as though someone had been reading their dreams. On the 4th night they reached the dam, a massive wall of concrete that overlooked the valley, and Reyes said they could make their stand there, that if the dead wanted to talk, they could do it from the bottom of the spillway. And she rigged the place with the last of their explosives. But it came at dawn, a tide of them, walking and talking, chanting and screaming, their voices blending into something that almost sounded like laughter. And when they reached the base of the dam, Reyes waited until Carter gave the signal and then pressed the detonator. The explosion tore through the dam, sending millions of gallons of water roaring into the valley, sweeping the dead away in a single cataclysmic wave. And for a moment there was silence, real silence, the kind that felt holy after 90 days of moaning and whispering. Carter and Reyes stood together as the water drained, as the valley became a grave. And for the first time since the world ended, they allowed themselves to breathe without fear, knowing they had not just survived day 90, but had given humanity something it had not had in a long time, a chance. When the sun rose, Carter climbed the ridge and looked out over the valley where the dead had been, and said softly that the dead might one day learn to speak again. But today they had been silenced, and for as long as he lived, he would fight to keep it that way.